So here we go again. The internet outrage machine in full force. And so I want to talk to you today about something that's a little strange. You see, in 1968, Star Trek aired an interracial kiss on national television. First time that had been done. And there's a really good story to how that actually came to be, which we'll get into in a little bit. During the Cold War, it put a Russian officer on the bridge of an American starship. And one of the most important civil rights leaders in American history convinced one of its actors not to quit. Yet today, some viewers insist Star Trek has become too political. Star Trek has gone woke. And that raises a really interesting question. Did the franchise change? Or has the audience forgotten what the show was always trying to accomplish? Welcome back to Country Cynic. We're going to follow the timelines, the incentives, and the numbers because sooner or later the narrative has to face the math. So let's see how this story shapes up. Before Star Trek ever became controversial, it almost never aired. The original pilot didn't impress the NBC executives, and they thought the show was too intellectual, too weird, and quite frankly, too expensive. And most shows in that same situation would have just quietly disappeared and died. But Star Trek had one very unusual advantage. The studio producing the show was Desilu Productions, and the person running Desilu was Lucille Ball. And yes, it is that Lucille Ball, the comedian who dominated the television in the 1950s. Network executives wanted to pass on the show, but Lucille Ball insisted they pay for another pilot. That almost never happens in television history. Most shows would just die right there and go away. But Star Trek survived because one of the most successful television producers in the world believed in a strange little science fiction show about diplomacy in space, which means the entire franchise exists today because Lucille Ball took a gamble. But once the show finally aired, the first controversy wasn't the storylines. It was simply who was standing on the bridge. So Gene Roddenberry had a very specific vision for the Enterprise. He wanted a crew that would look like the future of humanity, which meant that the crew had to look like the world. You had a black communications officer, a Japanese helmsman, and a Russian navigator. And while today that doesn't sound unusual, the context here matters because World War II had barely ended 20 years earlier. The Cold War was still raging, and civil rights protests were still happening all across the United States. And yet, here was this television show casually presenting a future where Americans, Russians, and Japanese officers served together peacefully on the same starship. He was making a prediction. He believed humanity would eventually grow out of its tribal instincts. But the real impact of the show became clear behind the scenes because one single conversation would change television history forever. So after the first season, Nichelle Nichols, the actress who was playing Lieutenant Uhura, started to think about leaving the show. Her role wasn't very large at the time, and she really wanted to return to theater and had been getting quite a few offers to do so. But before making that decision, she attended an event and happened to meet someone who immediately recognized her. And that person was Martin Luther King Jr. He told her something remarkable. He told her she could not quit the show. What she was doing mattered because for the first time on television, Black Americans could see themselves represented as, not as servants or background characters, but as a skilled officer on the bridge of the Enterprise. And King told her Star Trek was showing people a future where different races work together as equals. And that television mattered. So she stayed. And think about that for a moment. One of the most important civil rights leaders in America has personally intervened to keep a science fiction character on television.
By the end of the first season, I had so much fan mail that I didn't know I had, that was in the mail room, that they offered me a contract. I also was offered a role, a play to do that was Broadway bound. And I was going to leave the show and take that. And it was a good role. Forget what the heck it was now. And so I went in and told Gene that I was going to, when the season was up, I was going to leave. And Gene says, "You can't do that." Yes, I can. And he said, "Don't you understand what I'm trying to achieve here?" I said, "Gene, you've been wonderful, and I really thank you for this opportunity. But you know, my life is theater, musical theater, and I'm getting offers for all kinds of wonderful things where I want to be." And he was sitting behind his desk, and he looked up at me and he said, and I handed him my resignation that I'd written out. And he took it, I finally laid it on the desk, and he looked at it and he said, "Take the weekend, Michelle," because that's how I know it was either Thursday or Friday. And he said, "And think about it. And if you feel the same way the beginning of next week, if you still feel that way, think about this. It's more than you think it is. Just think about it. And if you still want to go on by Monday morning, I'll give you my blessing. You go with my blessings." And he took the resignation and stuck it in his desk drawer. And I said, "Thanks, Gene," and I skipped out of there. Whew, that went better than I thought. And as fate would have it, I've always used this way because I believe in fate. I believe it was fated. I was to be a celebrity guest at some fundraising thing in Beverly Hills. I believe it was an NAACP fundraiser, but it might not have been, but I think it was. And so I went to do this on that Saturday night, and I had just been taken to the dais and sat down when the organizer came over and said, "Miss Nichols, how are you?" and blah, blah, blah. And he said, "Listen, there's someone here who said he is your biggest fan," and he's looking chirpy, you know, and he said, "and he's desperate to meet you. He really wants to meet you." So I said, "Certainly," and I stand up and turn, and I'm thinking, it's a Star Trek fan. He said, "It's a Star Trek fan. I'm looking for a young man who's a Star Trek fan." I turn, and instead of fan, there's this face the world knows with this beautiful smile on it. And I remember thinking, whoever that fan is going to have to wait, because Dr. Martin Luther King, my leader, is walking toward me, not 10 feet away, with a beautiful smile on his face. And then this man says, "Yes, Miss Nichols, I am that fan. I am your best fan, your greatest fan. And my family are your greatest fans. As a matter of fact, this is the only show on television that my wife, Coretta, and I will allow our little children to watch, to stay up and watch." because it's on past their bedtime. And I said, which was all that I was able to say, my mouth just opened and closed. He said, "We admire you greatly, you know." And he said some more things, and the manner in which you've created this role has dignity and so forth. And he said, you know, and before he said, I said, Dr. King, thank you so much. And then I got the courage to say, and I really am going to miss my co-stars. And he said, what do you mean? Dead serious. What are you talking about? I said, well, I've had an off. He said, you cannot. And I said, well, I'm going to leave Star Trek because going to say have an offer to star in I never got that far. I said, well, I'm leaving Star Trek. He said, you cannot. You cannot. And I felt like that little boy Willis. What you talking about, Dr. King? But you know I didn't say that, no. But I was taken aback, and I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. He said, don't you understand what this man has achieved, is achieving or something? And I thought, deja vu all over again. I just looked at him. He said, for the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day, as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can sing, dance, but who can go into space, who can be lawyers, who can be teachers, who can be professors, who are in this day, and yet you don't see it on television until now. And he went on, so many of the things, perhaps some of the things he said, but I could say nothing. I just stood there, realizing every word that he was saying was the truth. And he said, if you leave, Nichelle, Gene Roddenberry has opened a door for the world to see us. If you leave, that door can be closed because, you see, your role is not a black role. And it's not a female role. He can fill it with anything, including an alien. And at that moment, the world tilted for me. And I knew then, I didn't want to know it because I was going to go through some more turmoil for the rest of the week. But I knew that I was something else, that the world was not the same. And that's all I could think of was Dr. King. Everything that he had said. The world sees us for the first time as we should be seen. And I remember being angry come Sunday or whatever. Why me? Why should I have to? Whatever happened come Monday morning, I went to Gene, and I'm not sure to this day if I knew what I was going to say. He's sitting behind that same dang desk. And whoever he was talking to had to leave because I went there first. And I said, Gene, and I told him what happened. And I said, if you still want me to stay, I'll stay. I have to. And he opened his drawer and he looked up at me and said, God bless Dr. Martin Luther King. Somebody knows where I'm coming from. And I said, that's what he said in my brain. And he took out my resignation, which was torn into 100 pieces, and handed me the pile. And we just stood there looking at each other. And I finally said, thank you, Gene. And he said, thank you, Nichelle. And my life's never been the same since. And I've never looked back. I've never regretted it. Because I understood the universe had somehow, that universal mind had somehow put me there. And we have choices. Are we going to walk down this road, or are we going to walk down the other? And it was the right road for me.
And just 2 years later, Star Trek aired a moment that made television history. So in 1968, Star Trek aired an episode called Plato's Stepchildren. And in that episode, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura shared a kiss. And today, that might not seem remarkable. But in 1968, it was pretty explosive because interracial relationships were still very controversial in many parts of the United States. And some stations were nervous about even airing the episode. So the production team decided to film an alternate version without the kiss, just in case. Unfortunately, actor William Shatner reportedly sabotaged all those takes by crossing his eyes, messing up his timing, basically forcing the studio to use the original footage, meaning the only thing they could use was the footage with the kiss. And it aired. And today we celebrate that. But at the time, it made television executives very nervous. But the debates surrounding Star Trek didn't stop there. They simply evolved. So now we fast forward to 1990, and television's changed pretty dramatically. But there's still one thing that's pretty rare, and that was a woman leading a major science fiction franchise. Then came Star Trek Voyager, and suddenly the captain wasn't Kirk, it wasn't Picard, it was Captain Catherine Janeway. Now, today that may seem pretty normal, but in the 1990s it sparked quite a bit of debate. Some critics argued that audiences would not accept a female captain. Others said the franchise was becoming too political. So it's a different decade, but the same argument. The next Star Trek series would take the conversation in a completely different direction. All right, so then you've got Deep Space Nine, and they did something really unusual because instead of focusing on purely exploration, it focused on consequences. The show did feature the first black-led captain in Star Trek, Benjamin Sisko, but the real innovation was philosophical. The show explored questions science fiction usually avoided: religion, colonial occupation, war trauma, political compromise, and moral ambiguity. For decades, Star Trek had portrayed the Federation as the moral center of the universe. And Deep Space Nine asked harder questions, like what happens when survival forces you to compromise your ideals? In one famous episode, it ends with Sisko admitting he manipulated events to bring enemy power to war. And at the end of the episode, he says something extraordinary: I can live with it. You see, Star Trek had evolved from imagining the future to asking what it cost to protect it. And that brings us to the modern debate. So today, the conversation revolves around the newer series. More diverse casts, LGBTQ characters, new social themes, and once again, some fans say the franchise has suddenly become political. But when you look at the history of Star Trek, you start to notice a pattern. Every generation says the same thing. The new version's too political. It's too progressive. It's too different from what came before. And then 20 years later, that same version becomes nostalgic classic because Star Trek has always done the same thing. It takes the cultural debates of its time and projects them into the future. Roddenberry wasn't predicting technology, he was asking something far more interesting. He was asking, what would humanity look like if we actually solved our problems? Listen, Linda, I understand the instinct behind nostalgia. People want the stories that they grew up with to stay exactly the same. But Star Trek was never meant to preserve the past. It was designed to imagine a better future. A future where people cooperate a little more, understand each other a little better, and occasionally rise above their worst instincts. Now, that doesn't mean that every new series is going to work. Some experiments will fail, but that's true of any franchise. Yet the core idea hasn't really changed in 60 years. And Star Trek keeps asking the same question: what kind of people could we become if we tried a little harder? And that reminds me of something that Dolly Parton once said: figure out who you are and do it on purpose. Because Star Trek's been doing that on purpose since 1966. And the uncomfortable truth with that is, the future Roddenberry imagined requires us all to grow up a little bit. And that has been making viewers nervous for nearly 60 years. The more that time passes, the more I notice that the same debates come around with every generation. Different headlines, same arguments. Same script, different cast. Will we ever live up to the vision that Gene Roddenberry had for humanity? Only time will tell. And anyway, that's just how I see it. Y'all take care of each other out there, all right?